Well, welcome once again. It's very nice to see you all. When one's giving a series of lectures, one's always a little worried that the second lecture might see a severe diminution of the people in front of one, but the numbers seem to have held up pretty well, so that's reassuring. So Alicia has given you a sort of overview of what's in store today. A huge terrain, a vast terrain, and a subject which can't, of course, really be adequately dealt with in an hour, but I shall really just be putting up a few signposts, so to speak, and trying to give you the most essential ideas in Schuon's understanding of the Religio Perennis, as distinct from the Sophia Perennis. Now, they're not two different things by any means, but they're expressed traditions, the logically based societies are on. So are we to call their constellations of beliefs and practices religion or something else? Well, for the purpose of this exercise today, I want to distinguish the historic religious traditions from primordial mythologies. So what I'm talking about today is Schuon's thought about those traditions which we can more or less locate in time. Not always easy, but with most of the great religious traditions, we know when they started, we know how they started, we know what compromises them, in a way which we don't know about primordial mythologies. If we ask ourselves, well, where did the myths of the Aboriginal Dreamtime in Australia come from? Or where did the myths of the American Indians come from? We can't answer that question. We can't put a date on it or a person or a text. We can't say, well, it started here. With the religious traditions, by and large, we can answer those sorts of questions. A quote which I meant to read yesterday but didn't, from Schuon: in all epochs, and in all countries, there have been revelations, religions, wisdoms. Tradition is a part of mankind, just as man is part of tradition. So you'll notice there, revelations, religions, wisdoms. So all of these are part of the Sophia Perennis in overall, but it's the religions as we understand them that form the Religio Perennis. And this is one of the differences between Guénon and Schuon. Schuon is much more focused on the Religio Perennis rather than the Sophia Perennis. And for this reason, they often use the word tradition in slightly different ways. So this is one of the key terms that we need to get sorted out straight away. So let's get into that. Traditions. Tradition. What does the word mean? Well, we could ask Henry Ford, father of industrial mass production and so on. Here's what Henry Ford had to say. I don't know much about history, and I wouldn't give a nickel for all the history in the world. History is more or less bunk. It is tradition. We want to live in the present. And the only history that is worth a tinker's damn is the history we make today. So you see Henry Ford's view of tradition is not a very happy one. Or we might ask Friedrich Engels. Tradition is a great resistant force and the inertia of history. Yet, because it is only negative, it must be destroyed. No, tradition, very bad thing. A contemporary English writer says tradition is one of those words conservative people use as a shortcut to thinking. A couple of slightly more sympathetic formulations about tradition. Lewis Mumford, historian of architecture and so on. Traditionalists are pessimists about the future and optimists about the past. Or G.K. Chesterton, tradition means giving voices to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors, It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to that arrogant oligarchy who merely happen to be walking around at the moment. So a more ambivalent sort of definition of tradition. You will notice in all of these that tradition seems to be associated with the past. It's something we've left behind. And insofar as it still has any hold, it's the kind of baggage of the past, weighing us down. A purely temporal kind of concept of tradition, and by and large a negative one, a pejorative one. Tradition is something we need to jettison, we need to liberate ourselves from. Now, really, ladies and gentlemen, tradition is a very pregnant term, a very weighty term, and it's a religious and we might almost say a cosmological term. It's not merely a historical term. As Gainon says, the very idea of tradition has been destroyed to such an extent that those who aspire to recover it no longer know which way to turn. So part of Gainon's mission is to renovate, rehabilitate, recuperate the whole idea of tradition. Now, strangely enough, in traditional times, there is no idea of tradition. Traditional cultures, traditional peoples don't deal in this concept of tradition. When Marco Polo went to Tibet for the first time in the 1930s and then on two subsequent visits, having immersed himself in the perennialist point of view as espoused by Gainon and Schuon and others, his head was full of this idea of tradition. So everywhere he went in Tibet, he started talking about tradition. And people were very puzzled. They didn't know what he was on about. Anyway, he eventually managed to explain it all and they got some idea of what he was talking about. So they referred to him from thenceforth as Mr. Tradition. Marco Polo was known in Tibet as Mr. Tradition. Here's what Dr. Nasser has to say about this term. Earlier peoples lived in worlds so impregnated with what we now call tradition that they had no sense of a separate concept called tradition, as it has been necessary to define and form, and also knew of periods of decadence of their own civilizations and cultures, but they had no experience of a totally secularized and anti-traditional world necessitate the definition and formulation of. It's actually very important, and it's because perennialism, as we now understand it, and particularly through its most eminent exponents like Dr. Nasser and Schuon and Burkhardt and so on, the perennialist movement is a response to this new situation in which we live in an anti-traditional culture, and anti-traditional civilizations have been normal. It is the modern civilization which is aberrant and abnormal, anti-traditional. Schuon says traditions appear out of the infinite like flowers. Now, of course, as far as most of us are concerned, we are preoccupied with one revelation, which we belong. There are many revelations that they are all valid, that they all lead to traditions. Okay. The other idea, which is implicit in what Martin Ling says, it's an idea that we find articulated repeatedly in Schuon's work, is human diversity. If we look at human peoples, we look at human groups, we look at human cultures, are we all the same? Well, the modern tendency is to say yes. We're all the same. Basically, we're all the same. The differences are more or less accidental, and it's best if we don't focus too much on the differences, best if we just concentrate on our shared humanity, our common characteristics. And such differences as there are to be regarded as more or less accidental or contingent on circumstances. This is not the way Schuon thinks about it. Schuon says that there are distinct human groups. Schuon uses the word races, which is highly problematic. It's a very volatile term and it is so misused and used in so many different ways that it's not really a very helpful term, I think, or at least it's a term to be used carefully if one is going to use it at all. So I will just talk about human groupings rather than races. And these races are not accidentally different, they are fundamentally different. Of course, we all have a shared humanity, and of course, the most important things we do share. We all have a soul. We all have a vocation. We all have a destiny. But the differences are also important because the differences are psychological, temperamental, makes us receptive to different sorts of things. We're on different wavelengths, so to speak. So the revelations, each revelation is directed towards a particular portion of humanity and is attuned to the particular needs of that human group. Now, this raises another very interesting question. If this is true, what does it imply about the issue of conversion? Well, it implies that this is a step to be taken very, very cautiously and under peculiar circumstances. The natural state of affairs is that we are born into a religion. We are born into a situation where everything around us is permeated with that particular revelation, issuing with that particular religion, issuing from that particular revelation, which has been addressed to the receptivities and proclivities of this human group. So to step outside that and go somewhere else, which is sometimes necessary, and of course what Schuon himself did, at least on a sort of formal level, it's not a step to be taken lightly. Anyway, that's another issue. That's a red herring. I'm not going to go after it. You can ask me questions about it later if you want. Okay, let me read a passage from Schuon, which bears on what I've just been talking about. What determines the differences among forms of truth, the differences between forms of truth, the differences between the religions, if you like, is the difference among human receptacles. For thousands of years already, humanity has been divided into several fundamentally different branches, which constitute so many complete humanities, more or less closed in on themselves. The existence of spiritual receptacles so different and so original demands differentiated refractions of the one truth. Differentiated refractions of the one truth. The plurality of religions is no more contradictory than the plurality of individuals. In Revelation, God makes himself, as it were, an individual in order to address the individual. Homogeneity in relation to other revelations is inward and not outward. If humanity were not diverse, a single divine individualization would suffice. But man is diverse not only from the point of view of ethnic temperaments, but also from that of spiritual possibilities. The diverse combinations of these two things make possible and necessary the diversity of revelations. So, multiple revelations means multiple religions. Multiple religions are divinely appointed. There's no cause to be upset or disturbed by this state of affairs. Of course, it does raise certain difficulties, which I'll get to a little bit later when I'm talking about esoteric and exoteric dimensions of religion. Okay, a few general points about religious traditions. Each religious tradition, it's everything welfare, each tradition. This leads to some kind of interesting phenomena which on the face of it might appear to be a bit anomalous, but they're not really. Let us take the issue of Buddhism. So as everybody knows, Buddhism is non-theistic. There is no allowance in mainstream Buddhism for the idea of a deity. But if we look around in Buddhism, we can find theistic Buddhism in the Shin school, the Pure Land school. Likewise in Christianity. Christianity, of course, like Judaism and Islam, is overwhelmingly theistic, monotheistic and theistic. None more so than Islam. But we find in the Islamic tradition and in the Christian tradition and in the Jewish tradition certain apophatic metaphysics and mysticism, which somehow seem to take us beyond the deity, Eckhart's phrase, beyond being, beyond being. So everything's there in any one particular tradition. Everything's there. All spiritual possibilities can be realised within any one particular tradition. Each tradition has a kind of core of metaphysical truths, but they are not usually, often expressed in a kind of metaphysical vocabulary. They are veiled, as Schuon says, in all sorts of ways. They are communicated through stories, through myths, through parables, through symbols. But each religion necessarily has a metaphysical core. That is to say, a cluster of beliefs, not even beliefs isn't the right word, a cluster of truths pertaining to the nature of the absolute, which we might call God, we might call Allah, we might call Brahman, we might call it the Tao. It doesn't matter what name we give it, it's all the same thing. There is only one of whatever you want to call it, the absolute, God, whatever, there is only one. Only one. And in each tradition, there is a core of beliefs and practices relating to the nature of the absolute and our relationship with it. And that metaphysical, that core of metaphysical truths is the, what shall we say, is the quarry of a perennialist. What do we want to find? We want to find that core of metaphysical truths that are in each of the traditions. But most believers are not engaged in that pursuit. What they're engaged is following the dictates of the tradition to which they belong. Every tradition has its own prescriptions about what we need to do. You've got the 5 pillars in Islam, incumbent on all Muslims. Each religion has got its prescriptions, its mode, its spiritual mode. That's what the vast majority of believers are concerned with. They're not concerned with the question of, well, what has my religion got in common with the religion of people in China or Africa or wherever. So the pursuit of the metaphysical truths in a way which detaches them, so to speak, from their religious context, that is not the business of the vast majority of people. And again, that need not concern us. Although we do have to deal with the problem of the inevitable, well, at best, what shall we say, the sort of tension, the tension between what Schuon would term the exoteric mentality, the exoteric believer, and the esoteric, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So multiple revelations, diverse human groups, different receptivities, different spiritual modalities. Another very important point in the Schuonian understanding of things is that the age of revelations is over. We know this from the Quran. The Quran says so. Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. No more prophets, no more revelations. This does not mean there is no more communication from the divine. Of course it doesn't mean that. If there were no more communication between the terrestrial human world and the divine world, well, the world wouldn't be here. It'd be all over. The show would be over. It would be closed down. So, of course, that remains open. But there is not intuitions of the ancient rishis in India that gave rise to the Vedas. There is not going to be another revelation such as will bring forth a whole new religious tradition. Now, this idea upsets a lot of people, and, you can sort of understand why from their point of view. You're being intolerant, you're not being accepting of new religions, and, But Schuon is quite adamant on this, very clear. Anything which claims to be a new religion based on a new dispensation, a new divine revelation, we can dismiss. Now, there are certain problematical phenomena for which Schuon makes some kind of allowance, but we won't confuse the issue by going there just at the moment. Let's focus now on religion. Well, first of all, just looking at it in a very mundane kind of sense, an everyday kind of sense, what do we see when we see religion? Well, I think there are 5 or 6 things we always see. They're always there in one way or another. 1, myths. That is allegorical stories, which, as I was saying yesterday, have got a metaphysical dimension, a cosmological dimension, an anthropological dimension. The 4th dimension, which I didn't mention yesterday, is the sort of moral dimension. Now, if you look at any traditional myth, you can find these different dimensions within it. So all religions have got them. We've got doctrines. That is to say, the ways in which the truths revealed at the beginning have been formulated, have been understood, have been commented on over a period of time. This kind of builds up and you get a canonical body of doctrines that are accepted by believers by and large. So these, again, are about the nature of God, about the nature of eternity, infinity, the absolute. And they give us some means of discriminating between the absolute and the relative. So all religions have got their doctrines. All religions have got a set of ethical values or ideals. And again, these aren't necessarily the same, although essentially they're the same, but superficially at least they are different. One way of formulating that problem, which I'll be talking more about in the 4th lecture, is that the virtues are absolute and the moralities are relative. Maybe you can understand that now, maybe you can't. If not, well, we'll talk about it more another day. We have rituals, certain things we have to practice. What is a ritual? The easiest way of understanding a ritual is that it is a set of symbols in motion. Usually, but not always, done with other believers, other adherents. We can perform rituals on our own, but more often than not, we're performing them in a kind of community of believers. And we always have, as I said earlier, sacred art. Now, a paradoxical idea, but it's very important to get hold of this one if you want to understand Schuon's perspective on religion. Religion comprises the formalization of formless truths, or formless truth, if you like. The formalization of formless truth. The truth itself is formless. It is ineffable. It cannot be put in words. A form gives us access to the formless truth. It's a difficult kind of notion, but it's important. Now, what is a form? Well, let us take geometric forms just as an example. This is an image that Schuon sometimes uses. Geometric forms, triangles, squares, oblongs, circles, crosses. Each geometric form deals with the extension of space. There's something that all the forms have in common. They all deal with spatial relationships and so on. But each one is distinct. You cannot be a triangle and a circle at the same time, right? Well, by way of not rhomboid, forgotten, a parallelogram. So each form, each religion expresses in its own way a truth which can be expressed in any number of ways. Are you with me? Are you following me? So the religions are like different forms. Now, are we going to sit here, ladies and gentlemen, and have an argument about whether a triangle is superior to a square? I mean, what a silly argument that would be. Where would it get us? Nowhere. Much better to just understand that these are two different forms. Each has its own distinctive characteristics and possibilities. And so it is religion. So it is with religions. Schuon says truth is situated beyond forms, whereas revelation, or the tradition that derives from it, belongs to the formal order, and that indeed by definition. But to speak of form is to speak of diversity and thus of plurality. Now, here's the nub of it. A religion is a form and so also a limit. A religion is a form and so also a limit which contains the limitless, to speak in paradox. Every form is fragmentary because of its necessary exclusion of other formal possibilities. The fact that these forms, when they are complete, that is to say, when they are perfectly themselves, each in their own way represent totality, does not prevent them from being fragmentary in respect of their particularization and their reciprocal exclusion. A traditional perspective, or mythology in inverted commas, is to total truth what a geometric form is to space. Each fundamental geometric form is an adequate image of the whole of space, but each excludes the others. So that's just recapitulating what I said in a much more clumsy fashion a few moments ago. Each religion is the religion. Each religion is the religion and a religion. The religion, inasmuch as it contains within itself the truth and the means of attaining the truth. A religion, since it emphasises a particular aspect of truth in conformity with the spiritual and psychological needs of the humanity for whom it is destined. Revelation speaks an absolute language because God is absolute, not because the form is. In other words, the absoluteness of the revelation is absolute in itself, but relative qua form. Okay. We'll leave that. That's a very deep issue. We'll leave that for the moment. So doctrine and method. So what religion provides us with is a way of knowing the truth, of understanding the truth, of understanding the real, the absolute and the relative. And it gives us a means of actualizing that truth within ourselves, not just here, not just, oh yes, I understand. Yes, I know the 39 articles of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Not just something up here, something actualised, internalised, something that shapes our being, something that pervades our being. Now, of course, this is not an easy thing, as you know. This is a lifetime's work. If we are able to do that, to actualise those truths, then we become a kind of, what shall we say, a kind of conduit between the divine and the terrestrial, between God and the world of Maya. So in Schuon's formula, it goes like this. this is worth focusing on. All the dogmas. Imagine the whole library of, well, just say Christian, the one I'm most familiar with. I mean, all the writings of Thomas Aquinas, Master of Eckhart, and the Church Fathers, all the dogmas as they've evolved over the centuries, all those dogmas, all the prescriptions, all the things we're told to do, all the dogmas, all the prescriptions, and all the means of religion, all the paraphernalia associated with religion, have their sufficient reason in three fundamental vocations of man: discernment, practice, and virtue. So getting it all right down into a nutshell, into a kind of capsule statement, down to the sort of essence, what is religion? It is those three things, as far as you and I are concerned: discernment, practice, and virtue. As St. John says in his gospel, nothing good comes to man but by way of heaven. So it's not a sort of human achievement. I'll be talking more about virtue in the fourth lecture. Now, the esoteric exoteric divide. Here we get onto some treacherous ground, some dangerous territory. The exoteric understanding, the exoteric mentality particularizes the universal. It particularizes the universal. There are universal truths that can be expressed in all sorts of ways. Those universal truths expressed in a particular way find their place in this or that religion, and that is where the exoteric mind is focused. Yes, the truths are universal, but they've been particularized. So they've taken on a particular colour, so to speak, taken on a particular colour. It's not just water anymore, it's coloured water. It's got a blue tinge, a pink tinge, a green tinge, whatever, which has been given to it in that particular religious context. The esoteric mind, on the other hand, universalizes the particular. So when it sees a particular doctrine, a dogma, a ritual, a practice, a symbol, it penetrates it. It sees through it, so to speak, beyond the particular to the universal. This means that there's a certain implicit tension between the exoteric and the esoteric. Now, the vast majority of people, the vast majority of believers are exoteric. They're concerned with the expression of truth as it is found in their religion, not in any other religion. How Taoists in China formulate these ideas, beliefs, doctrines, whatever, is of no concern. All that's of immediate and urgent concern is how your particular religion deals with this or that issue, this or that belief, this or that practice. And the esoteric perspective, the esoteric understanding is alien. It's foreign to the exoteric mentality. So the exoteric resists it, pushes back from the esoteric. And this is just how it is. This is in the nature of things. We're not going to suddenly turn everybody into Meister Eckhart or Rumi or Ibn Arabi or Lao Tzu. That's not how it works. For the vast majority of people, all they need is their religion. Adhere to that religion, follow the path. That's all you need to worry about. So there's this possible friction or tension between the esoteric and the exoteric. And you see this repeated over and over again in history. The great sages, the great mystics, the great metaphysicians, they're often treated with suspicion by the religious establishment. Sometimes it gets much worse than that. Sometimes they're persecuted, sometimes tortured, even killed. So this is a sort of very dramatic illustration of this sort of tension between the esoteric and the exoteric. Now, in the end, from the perennialist point of view, the exoteric view, of course, is limited, too particularised. And what we're looking for is the esoteric, the more universal view. But a very important aspect of the perennial philosophy as expounded by Schuon, and this is what differentiates Schuon from some other people, including Huxley, to whom Alicia, I think it was, made reference yesterday. You know, Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy, it's the book that did more than any other to popularise the term perennial philosophy, put it into currency. What was it, 1945, something like that, I think. The same year, incidentally, that The Reign of Quantity was published, Guénon's book. Perhaps, arguably, the most important book of the 20th century, The Reign of Quantity. So some of you will know about Huxley, but in case you don't, what Huxley does is, Huxley wants to say there's a common core to all the religions. There's a sort of essence that is shared by all the religions. So what he does is he's got these categories like, you know, morality, worship, death, eternity, all sorts of different aspects of religious life. And he goes around the world and he finds a whole lot of saints and he assembles them under these various heads to show that they all conform. They vocabulary, but they're saying the same thing. Okay, so let's detach this core of essential truths from its religious framework. The religious framework is just impedimenta, it's just paraphernalia. Let's get rid of it. We'll just focus on the essence. So, in other words, although I don't know that he's using these words, what Huxley is really proposing, when you get down to it, in the book, The Perennial Philosophy, is a kind of universal religion comprising these essential truths and jettisoning all the particular forms of this or that religion. Nothing could be further away from what Schuon recommends than Huxley. Huxley is the other end altogether. He's on a different trip. He was on a trip, various kinds of trips. What Schuon and all perennialists insist on is that the universal truth can only be reached through the particular forms. So the dogmas of any particular religion, the symbols, the practices, the rituals, the sacred art, all of that is indispensable. It is of incalculable value and must be preserved. And we must, each one of us, commit ourselves to one tradition. We believe in the validity of all traditions, the validity of all these multiple revelations. We believe God's spoken many times. We believe there are universal truths embodied in all these different traditions, but we must commit ourselves to one of them. That's not Huxley's position. What Huxley and his colleagues, you know, Jared Hurd and all those people, the Californian Vedantins as they were known, what they really are proposing is a kind of diluted, half-baked, ersatz version of Vedanta as a universal religion. Well, that won't do, ladies and gentlemen. It won't do at all. It's going to suffer the same fate as Esperanto. You know about Esperanto. What a wonderful idea. Let's get rid of languages. Let's all speak one language. We'll make up this new language, Esperanto. Well, how did that go? Went down like a lead balloon. How many people speak Esperanto? Anyone speak Esperanto here? I've never come across a single person anywhere in 78 years of human life. I've never come across an Esperanto-speaking person. So you see the parallel with religion. A religion which claims to be all-encompassing based on universal truths, but which has no particular forms, is no religion at all. We get to the truth not by bypassing forms, not by jettisoning, not by putting them in the rubbish bin, which is what Huxley wants to do, even though he's not quite that rude about it, but that's what he wants to do. We get to it by penetrating the religious form. Because religious forms are essentially symbolic. Now, what's this mean? It means they have an inexhaustible meaning. You can take any symbol you like. Take the Christian cross, for example. Some of you will have read Guénon's book, The Symbolism of the Cross. You can't limit the meaning of that symbol. It's inexhaustible. That's in the nature of symbols. That's how religions are. The meaning there is inexhaustible. How deep do we want to go? How far do we want to go? We can't get to the end of it. There is no exhaustive account. There are only adequate and suggestive accounts, so to speak. The core of truths in each religious tradition is most kept alive by the mystics, by the esoteric minority within that tradition. And once that core, that mystical core, is abandoned or fragmented, then the tradition is in all sorts of trouble and is prone to, as I was saying yesterday, what Guénon describes as solidification on one hand and dissolution on the other. And that is exactly what we're seeing in the contemporary world on all sorts of religious fronts. A retreat into a kind of very literalist, rigid, exclusivist, xenophobic, intolerant exclusivism on the one hand, or on the other hand, open door, laissez-faire, believe whatever you like, that's okay. You know the people, all sorts of people who claim to have access to some new mystical wisdom that no one's ever understood before. Even Vivekananda, who in many respects is a very impressive figure, even Vivekananda indulges in this kind of nonsense, talks about spiritual evolution. Spiritual evolution, can you believe it? He says, well, the Buddha and Jesus were all very well, but we've moved on. People of the second level, we're up here, we're on a higher level. We've had 2,000 years of spiritual evolution. This is even more nonsensical than biological evolution, which we'll be talking about another day.